Okay, colleagues, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Bernard Munoz. I'm the head of policy advocacy and campaigns working for the Global Campaign for Education. So it's a real pleasure having you all here in this launching of this fantastic group. So we will start this event, and I will welcome our great moderator, Juliana Rodriguez de Sena. So Juliana, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Werner. And thanks for the Global Campaign for Education for making this happen. I am Juliana from the Transnational Institute, and I'll be your host for today. Before we begin, I would like to please note that this session will be held in English and Spanish, and that we have interpretation in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. You can find the interpretation button on the bar below. Once you click it, Zoom will display the options. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. Don't be shy, share your questions and comments in the chat. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand once the Q&A session starts. On this session, we'll be talking about a chapter on the book, The Great Takeover. You will find now a link on the chat for the English and the Spanish versions. I'll put it right away. And that being said, I'd like then to call Madhuresh Kumar to present us the chapter Education, a Big Business for Businesses, Multi-Stakeholderism in the Global Education Governance. I know you have probably been expecting Marianne as advertised, but she had an emergency and unfortunately could not attend. So Madhuresh was kind enough to fill in. He is co-author of the book and actually the lead researcher on the chapter on education. Madhuresh is also an Indian activist researcher currently based in Paris. He's a project director of the Global Gas Hub, engaged in urgent and rapid delivery of a global phase out of fossil gas. For more than a decade, he was a national convener of the National Alliance of People's Movements, responsible for political strategy development, alliance building and networking, campaigns, and policy advocacy around communities' control over land, water, forest, and minerals. He's also an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics and Resistance Studies Fellow at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Welcome, Madhuresh. Thanks again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. And thanks also for the Global Campaign for Education and Transnational Institute for giving me this opportunity. This is a task we took last year during the time of the pandemic. And this is part of a larger project where the working group on multi-stakeholderism interested me and Marianne with looking at 5 sectors: so education, health, agriculture, environment and climate. And we looked at the multi-stakeholderism from various perspectives. And when we have used the term MSI, multi-stakeholder initiative, multi-stakeholderism. So during the course of the book, if you read in detail, you will find that we have used the term interchangeably. I also must say that I'm no expert, and Werner, Juliana, and many others on this call, they are the expert on this. We have looked at some of those. So I will just present to you the chapter, the highlights from the chapter in a PowerPoint. And there are more details in the chapter, but here it is for your reference. I'll just... Sorry. This is something, and I think the title, Education, a Big Business for Businesses, and this is what we found, that across the sector, the 5 sectors we studied, this was a common emerging theme which we discovered. And this is happening, the rise of the big business is happening at the back of the multilateralism. So our overall conclusion is that the multilateralism or pluralism is giving way to the multi-stakeholderism. And through that, the big businesses are making a big push actually to take over the global governance. And in this particular, the education one, we don't have the power of the big tech, which came up very prominently, but in the health and the internet and technology, they were really the dominant players. But they have an imprint also in education sector. With that, just a brief background that generally the health and education, these are the two sectors which has always been into the realm of the government and the state, because these are the two sectors, and that's how the UN institutions have also been very involved since the beginning. And because of their link with the poverty alleviation, international financial institutions have also been very closely involved with it. And until 1980s, I would say that both of them didn't have much education and health didn't have a lot of attention at the global governance level. They were parts of the development agenda or part of the poverty alleviation agenda, but not a great focus. In the late 80s, sometime around in late 80s, with this suddenly changed because UNICEF, UNESCO, World Bank, and UNDP, they together joined hands and said, we need to bring this on a focus. And then the World Conference on Education for All happened. And since then, it has been every year there is this World Conference on Education for All has been happening. It's comparable to World Health Summit or the other specific themes, which theme-based events which UN organizes on the international or on the IT sector. There is international trade. They also organize something. In 1990s, but there is a similar, so in late 80s, this happens. But then 1990s onwards, and I think there is a close link there that because of the reforms, neoliberal reforms, which are happening everywhere. So that's how they also came, these four institutions together came to look at how do we reform the education sector. And in 2000, then it finds a mention in the Millennium Development Goals, and in 2015, then it gets a further mention in the Sustainable Development Goals. And these two, actually, the MDGs and SDGs, have been instrumental in pushing a lot of the multi-stakeholder initiatives. And this is across the sectors, 5 sectors we have studied. So pretty much what I'm portraying here, you will find the same trend in almost all the sectors we have studied here. This is our methodology, what we looked at, because we knew it's a very big period. So we tried to restrict ourselves between 2000 to 2020. And then we studied 12 multi-stakeholder initiatives. We took what categories, so policy development, project implementation, paradigmatic, or the campaign, or the financing facility. These are the 4 categories we found in which most of the work of the MSIs were limited. Typography, so what kind of typography? Some of them were UN-led, some were academic institutions-led, some were corporate sector or by various specific to financing, or some various specific, issue-specific. So that was the typography we found. These are the MSIs which we studied, starting with the Global Partnership for Education in 2002, and then all the way till 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, these 3 which came in: Global Education Coalition, International Finance Facility for Education, Save Our Future. These 3 were formed right when the pandemic was unfolding. And then the Global Education Initiative of the World Economic Forum. This started in 2003, but ended in 2011, but actually it transformed itself. And it got absorbed into the various UN processes. I'll talk about it later. And as we desegregate the data, what we find is that actually is the second decade of the this century, 21st century, that when most of the MSIs have been launched. This is different from what we have observed in the health sector or in the others, but still this period is very significant. And within this, if you divide this decade, then we find is that 8 of the MSIs were launched in the second half, which is post the SDGs were announced. So 2015, the SDGs were announced, and after that, it got a big push since then. And how even in this evolution that when they were formed, if you look at it, there have been a lot of shifting priorities. Pardon the delays, there is some noise, there is some construction happening in my neighborhood. So there is a a lot of background noise. I'm sorry to the translators for that. And the shifting, there have been shifting priorities. That the right to education was in the beginning of the 21st century. That was the right to education was a big priority, and primary education was a big focus. In fact, but then in the second half of the last decade, so from post SDGs, if you see, then the primary education and the digital ICT takes center stage. And if you look at the 25% of the MSIs, we are focused on ICT and then employment capacity building. So the focus, if you think of it, slowly starts moving from emphasis on learning to employment, or to how are people get skilled. So the skill building rather than education and learning, the focus has shifted. And I think as the focus has shifted, the role of the private corporations has come in. So it's both ways, actually. The space is created through the policy development, and then the stage is set through the policy development, and then the private businesses come in to fulfill those, and they become the strategic partners, implementing partners, and others. And you will see how their influence has grown within the governances and the overall. So if you move further, then this is again the same thing, typology, that how they have changed over a period of time. And what we find is that the push for the private sector actually came at the back of participatory decision making and public-private partnership. And this is very interesting because in 2003, so some of in 2015 onwards, I said that the number of multi-stakeholder initiatives came in. But then in 2003, the World Economic Forum undertook an experiment, which was through their Global Education Initiative program. And what they did was that they came up with a pilot project. They partnered with 4 governments, Egypt, India, and then 2 other governments. And they said, we are taking certain education building program, which will be with the help of Cisco, which is the IT company in the very beginning at that time. And together they will take experimental education initiative. They experimented with it, they presented their findings, and the way World Economic Forum functions, that after the program, they wanted to scale it up. So then they partnered with the UN and the UNICEF, and slowly, with the help of Gordon Brown, who you will see how he has fundamentally changed the whole education sector or the education governance globally, that it has now got absorbed within the UN system and through the world's multi-stakeholder initiatives. So the World Economic Forum starts something, then it puts it forward and gets integrated through the UN and the other government. So it's a very tried and tested formula in other sectors as well. What we noticed, that the World Economic Forum functions like that. And what happens is that who are the categories in most of the multi-stakeholder initiatives, if you're familiar with how they function, so they have various categories of representatives that who will have a table in their governing body or steering council and others. So if say the UN bodies, because as I said in the beginning, that the UN still remains influential. So UN bodies have the maximum number of 21 approved categories. In every MSI, the UN has a role to play in various formats. But then the northern donor governments, they have also played a key role. So this will include BFID or the NORAD or the US aid and the various development aid bodies of the northern organization. So Japan International Corporation, JICA and all. So they all remain very involved into this. And then 47% of the actors, total actors, so like the UN bodies, northern governments, or even other regional bodies like European Union, European Commission, they all form the major chunk of that. But after that, if you look at the big sector, which is having a bigger influence, that's the business, development finance, philanthropies, academic and research institutions, investor banks, and implementing agencies. So these are the other big sector players. Other than that, if you look for in the affected communities, so we think that in the education, and similar trend was observed in the health sector as well, that we would think that the teachers union or the students union or other NGOs who are working on those, that they will find a big representation. This is something which lacks, but this is still acceptable. But I think what is the biggest missing link in all of this in the MSIs is that the lower developing countries, they are the one who are almost absent. even though they are the ones who have the major chunk and they have the money, and they are the implementing organizations in their country policies. But the global governance agenda setting, standard setting, and all of that, they do not have the same level of representation which they should have. And this is across even within the health and in the other sector as well. So the dominance of the developed world and the high income countries, along with the private businesses, continue to remain into the governance system. Then that the UN and the private sector, they are actually competing for influence. So in the beginning, if the UN was the big one, but the 2015 onwards, as I said, that the SDGs, there have been a major influence of the private sector and the businesses. And this has been achieved, and this has been changed actually with the appointment of Gordon Brown as the UN Special Envoy for Global Education in 2012. Because with his coming, if you see, he has really brought in a very different dynamic to the overall governance agenda. And his footprint, like he as a chair, he pushed for many of these things. So like his imprints are visible on Education Commission 2015, which actually led to a number of recommendations for setting up of financing facilities. So that Education Cannot Wait Fund, he is a member there, Global Business Coalition for Education, International Commission on Financing, Global Education Opportunity, and there are several others. Other than that, he also, he is with the UN organizations and the MSI, but then he's also at the chair of the Global Strategic Infrastructure Initiative for the World Economic Forum. He sits on the board of the Kofi Annan Foundation. That's another influential player within the UN governance, multi-stakeholderism, Grasa Messel Trust, and others. In addition, he and his wife, Sarah Brown, they together have their own foundation, which plays many other roles in the overall governance system. And if I talk about the health, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, since the time they were set up in 2000 AD, they completely changed the governance of the health governance, global health governance. Same way, Gordon Brown is one person who we can say that he has really changed the global governance, global education governance. Private sector role is something which we need to think about, because it's not only about their dominance and profit making and everything. It's also about the fact that they are gearing for leadership, and it's a legitimacy question, because education is something which brings you power. It actually makes you look like it's a philanthropic activity. It's something which you can justify. And at times, if you see, it also actually whitewashes. And this is something which the Global Campaign for Education has pointed, that the Global Business Coalition for Education, which mobilizes money, also provides service advisory and others to various MSIs. And this is something which facilitates and creates a space for the private sector on the UN bodies. So they become members of those boards. They sit there, they use their corporate responsibility fund. But what is worst is that the 20 out of 28 members of Global Business Coalition for Education, they have been mentioned in serious cases of tax avoidance, tax evasion, or other types of legal questioning, which came up, and their name came in the Panama Papers database. Panama Papers is just one, but there have been several other leaks, and you will find that most of these corporations have very dubious record. So on one hand, they have the dubious record, but they also sit on the many of these boards and the MSIs. So it's a way to gain legitimacy, to ensure that how good they are. So it whitewashes in some ways their crimes, corporate crimes. And same way, these financing remains a big way, and whereby the innovative means of financing facilities. And I think here, the Global Business Council for Education is of course to be blamed for, but then the World Bank and IMF together, they also play a big role in pushing the neoliberal agenda. And I think their imprint is very much visible from the overall funding. And in fact, most of these funding, actually, it has been questioned. There are a number of these fundings which goes to the education, to the states or the least developing countries and others. They are very tied and to a specific projects. So Education for All or like several campaigns, they will get money for that. But the money will not be given for overall comprehensive development of education system, but it will be for against certain standards. And then those standards are compared through the achievements, how much percentage of targets were achieved, and also very targeted investments and the loans are given, which in a way many a times leads to weakening of the overall work system because of their emphasis on these targets. Teachers permanent. So teachers getting permanent employment, that is never on the agenda. Something which it's crucial and fundamental for a good quality education, good infrastructure for schools. So you may not have a good school building, but because of the ICT is a big component of now the education and everything, so you will have Wi-Fi in the school. I mean, and these are or computers in the schools, but not good money for the buildings. So you have money for computers, but not for that. And these are some of the problems within the way these loans or these investments are being given to the countries in the developing world. And but in short, they at the end become the power of the money, which is something to dominate how the governance functions. So in a way, it goes into the area where it continues to perpetuate the global dominance and the hegemony. And this is visible across different sectors which we have studied. What is the conclusion we draw from this? One is definitely that since the 90s, the policies are actually going towards the reforms. It's more not towards public education, but it's more privatization. The policies are changing, the standards are changing. It's more towards the skill building, not towards comprehensive learning and all. The arrival of the businesses and corporate philanthropies has actually further marginalized the civil society voices. So I know Global Campaign for Education is a huge global movement, and it has presence everywhere. But Werner and others can talk about it, that how their own influence within MSIs have been under severe attack. And in fact, many times they may not even find their voice there. And multilateralism is under attack, as I said. The change in the governance mechanism and all, these are some of the issues which we have witnessed across the board. So this is something what I think as movements and as people who are concerned about the education overall of our future generation, something which we need to worry about. And this is a trend visible not only in the education sector, but the multi-stakeholderism is a threat to overall global governance and multilateralism at the expense of the nation states, where elected representatives do not have the voice, but the philanthropies and the corporate philanthropies and the big businesses have a bigger say into our global governance agenda. Thank you very much. I hope some of you do get time to read the chapter in detail. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Madhuresh, for painting this very clear and staggering picture of the governments of education nowadays. And don't undersell yourself. You're definitely an expert here. Thank you very much for the great work and for the presentation. I would like to call now Werner Munoz from the Global Campaign for Education, and who has already introduced himself. So it's with you now, Werner.
Thank you very much, Juliana, and thank you, Madhuresh, for this absolutely fantastic presentation. So the GCE is very happy to participate in this, and to also we have worked with in the preparation of this book, and specifically on this chapter. So GCE strongly believes that the fight for human rights should be integral, should be comprehensive, because as we know that human rights are interrelated, we also believe that the advocacy work on human rights should also be interrelated. So we cannot just expect advancement in one area while the others remain abandoned, I mean, we can just not expect freedom and justice in Afghanistan while Afghan women remains under this kind of horrible domination. And at the same time, we cannot expect equality under the new colonial practices. So I think that this book clearly presents this kind of interrelated analysis, showing the cases of multi-stakeholderism in education governance, but also in the environmental cases, in health, in technology, food, and agriculture, among other topics. And this shows how kidnapped global agenda in the hands of the corporate power is trying to reduce human rights into public relations strategies, where it's more important the forms and the mechanisms than the reality of inequality, poverty, and crime. So this multi-stakeholder trend may disappear the sense of obligations and social responsibilities by melting the power relations into a false consensus or an artificial equality. I think that the microphone is open. Carla, ¿puedes cerrar tu micrófono, por favor? Gracias. So under the notion of multi-stakeholder, the corporate power, but also the patriarchal power, pretend running away from their obligations and from the problems they have caused by showing themselves as part of the solutions and even claiming for them the same right to participate in the decision making. But having a privileged position, the result of this is that the corporate power, oftentimes using the disguise of philanthropy, as have been explained, simply managed to wipe out civil society organizations from our traditional roles. So the most terrible image we currently have is corporate showing themselves as the new civil society. And this is happening under the eyes and agreement of some of the UN bodies and organizations, unfortunately. This is certainly a phase of the privatization processes which affect education systems, but not only education systems. Privatization of traditional public spaces and public education governance is a way to facilitate also tax evasion and elusion, fair trade and human rights expansion. Having the private and the corporate representatives setting the public agenda on education financing, for instance, is like asking the wolf taking care of the sheep, because corporates' main interest is maximizing the revenues, the business. So a market-based society is a fact in our times, no doubt about it. But it should not be the norm in those areas where common good is a goal. Dignity, justice, and equality are out of trade and should not be left in the hands of any business coalition to decide. So the book that we are launching today is setting the way we should work. So we celebrate the chance to learn together in this way, and that's why GCE commits to keep working together with you in this way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Werner. Indeed, we're all interconnected and so are all causes. Multi-stakeholderism is a threat to commons and public goods in every sector, indeed, and in every corner of the world. Now, to offer us a Latin American perspective on the phenomenon, I'd like to call Laura Giannichini. She is the coordinator of institutional development of the Latin American campaign for the right to education. She's a journalist, a social scientist, with a specialization in public policies for equity from Flaxo. She's currently pursuing a PhD in sociology at the University of São Paulo. Laura, welcome. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Juliana. Bueno, primero quería agradecer aquí la invitación y también la publicación de este tremendo libro, que creo que contribuye mucho para la comprensión de los actores corporativos y su participación en los procesos de toma de decisión en políticas educativas. Creo que es una gran contribución y, como decía Werner, ¿no? Aún más que analiza el fenómeno a partir de distintos campos, no solo del educativo, porque eso nos permite aprender de otras áreas y también generar la posibilidad de que nos articulemos intersectorialmente para hacer frente a ese fenómeno. Bueno, yo estoy acá un poco de atrevida, mis compañeros seguramente son muchos más capacitados que yo para comentar este libro, así que hago algunos comentarios totalmente despretenciosos aquí en alta voz y a modo de hipótesis y como resultado de algunas provocaciones que me han generado la lectura de este libro, ¿no? Un primer punto que me gustaría destacar es que es ese que se menciona sobre la gobernanza por multistakeholderismo, coincidir con la generalización del neoliberalismo y con la falencia de los espacios multilaterales en dar algunas respuestas a problemas emergentes de los años 80. Creo que ese punto es fundamental. Y aquí creo que tenemos que aprovechar para hacer una autocrítica, porque fuimos y seguimos siendo, creo, como movimiento social, incapaces de proponer un sistema económico alterno al capitalismo luego del agotamiento del socialismo. Creo que eso tiene que ser subrayado, porque si durante décadas el capitalismo avanzaba, pero con un contrapeso del socialismo, la verdad es que el neoliberalismo avanzó y sin una respuesta clara de modelo alterno posible, lo que debilita el proceso de resistencia, creo. También es importante subrayar que el neoliberalismo pasó 50 años sin avanzar, no surgió en los años 80, surgió en los años 1920 y 30, y solo empezó a concretarse como un experimento de los Chicago Boys justamente en nuestra región, en Chile, con la llegada del dictador Pinochet, y empezó a avanzar en otras partes y especialmente en Europa y Estados Unidos cuando el Fordismo y el estado de bienestar social al final de los 80 o en los 80 da señales de decadencia. Y justamente cuando el 1% más rico de la población empieza a perder su riqueza, mientras ellos estaban avanzando en la concentración de riqueza dentro de los países centrales, por decir, y concentrando riquezas en estados de bienestar social o fordista, no era un problema, pero cuando empiezan a perder la riqueza es que el neoliberalismo se configura como una alternativa real en distintas partes del mundo. Entonces creo que también hay que pensar que el neoliberalismo, solemos decir que hay o en el marco del neoliberalismo hay un achicamiento del Estado, porque se retira el Estado de la provisión de las políticas sociales, pero parece que lo que efectivamente pasa a existir es una alianza poderosa entre los estados nacionales, las corporaciones, las élites políticas y económicas y financieras, especialmente en los países de bajos y medianos ingresos, y con el apoyo tanto de organismos como el Banco Mundial, el Fondo Monetario Internacional, en nuestra región también el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Entonces, en un contexto de crisis, estos actores hacen estas alianzas, empiezan a brindar crédito a cambio de adopción de reformas y políticas neoliberales, adoptar políticas de austeridad fiscal, privatizaciones, precarización de los derechos laborales y de los derechos humanos en general. Pero creo que más allá que una etapa del sistema capitalista, ¿no? Yo entiendo que el neoliberalismo es una ideología y que se caracteriza como un discurso hegemónico dominante y que está basado en esa racionalidad económica, ¿no? En la idea de que la economía puede dar cuenta de todos los desafíos de las distintas esferas de la vida social. Y que gana esa racionalidad adentra el Estado y de hecho gana una fuerza simbólica muy fuerte. Entonces, creo que tenemos que recordar que los propios estados son relaciones sociales, son la condensación de luchas sociales y políticas presentes y pasadas. Entonces, en ese sentido también son dinámicos, ¿no? El Estado es dinámico, es una relación social dinámica. Y creo que a través de estos espacios de creación de espacios multi-stakeholder que se presentan como neutros y donde todos los actores son convocados a resolver los complejos y actuales problemas sociales, se logra ir diseminando esa racionalidad económica y neoliberal en los distintos espacios del Estado. Esos espacios se presentan como espacios democráticos sobre las políticas educativas y que acogen la mirada de todos y todas, pero son consolidados efectivamente porque transforman argumentos políticos en argumentos técnicos y porque también creo que toda la crítica que hacemos a elementos que evidentemente son problemáticos, las desigualdades, las concentraciones que siguen generando, esas críticas son acogidas por los actores dominantes, reinventadas y en discursos, en nuevos discursos. Entonces, creo que en el neoliberalismo no hay exactamente un achicamiento del Estado, hay una movilización del Estado en el sentido de esta universalidad, de la racionalidad económica para garantizar la dominación política y simbólica de las élites. Sí puede haber un achicamiento de la participación de los estados en la protección social, pero también hay un agrandamiento en términos de administración, de gestión pública, y que es capturada por estas oligarquías, reflejándose en procesos de privatización y alianzas público-privados. Yo creo que algunos autores están mencionando cómo se viene dando una brasilianización del mundo, ¿no? Con el aumento de las desigualdades, las pérdidas de los derechos sociales, la precarización del trabajo, la cultura de privilegios, la satisfacción de los intereses solo de las élites. Eso viene difundiéndose no solo en los países de bajos y medianos ingresos, pero también en los países de altos ingresos. Entonces, en ese sentido me genera una curiosidad pensar cómo estas grandes corporaciones que supieron ocupar estas iniciativas multi-stakeholders y directamente los espacios de los estados, empiezan a proponer mecanismos de modernización de estos estados ahora, en el sentido de la creación de estados de plataforma, y creo que eso está como también difuso en distintos campos, no solo en el de la educación. Entonces, creo que es algo que tenemos que mirar con cuidado, ¿no? Cómo estos estados de plataforma empiezan a ser presentados como una modernización del Estado y cómo eso también es posible que nos venga a controlar de otras maneras que quizás no estábamos tan habituados. Bueno, entonces creo que en ese sentido es fundamental que nosotros como defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos y que solemos subrayar los estados como titulares de obligaciones y los principales garantes de derechos, creo que tenemos que dar una discusión sobre qué estados son necesarios para garantizar estos derechos humanos, porque lo damos como hechos, pero no decimos exactamente qué estados queremos y hay transformaciones, ¿no? Otro punto que me ha llamado mucho la atención en la lectura del libro, y con eso voy terminando, es que se menciona que las iniciativas multi-stakeholders no han priorizado la educación. Entonces, la pregunta que me surge es ¿por qué se da ese interés renovado de las élites económicas y empresariales en la educación en los últimos 10 o 20 años, especialmente 10 años se dice que aumenta exponencialmente el número de ese tipo de iniciativas en el campo de la educación, ¿no? ¿Qué cambios ocurrieron para que ahora ellos tengan interés y también legitimidad para estar en estos espacios de gobernanza prioritarios de las políticas? La verdad es que hace 20 años los empresarios no tenían tanta legitimidad para actuar en el campo de la educación, probablemente porque era un área que no estaba tan vinculado a ese capital económico que ellos tienen, ¿no? Pero ahora lo que vemos, como mencionaban los compañeros, es que hay filántropos, hay consultores, organizaciones internacionales y transnacionales, think tanks, corporaciones, redes de corporaciones y que financian los actores anteriores, fundaciones privadas también, lobistas, asociaciones empresariales que están ávidas por orientar la construcción de las políticas educativas. Vemos que la educación ya no es tema de pedagogos, de sociólogos, de docentes, de estudiantes, no, las importantes voces en el campo son voces que vienen de la economía, son los CEOs de las empresas, los financieros. Entonces no sorprende que estos actores quieran influenciar las políticas y los marcos normativos justamente para transformar la educación en una mercancía y encontrando la educación como un espacio para hacer lucro. Ese es un elemento que menciona mucho el capítulo del libro, pero quizás, como creo que decía también Bernard, ¿no? Para llegar a esos procesos, esos actores tuvieron que tal vez disfrazarse en organizaciones sin fines de lucros, en instituciones filantrópicas, y empezar a adoptar un discurso tecnicista de las políticas, dicho basado en evidencias, en construcción de nuevas narrativas epistemológicas dominantes para consolidarse como voces importantes en este espacio. Seguramente en nuestra región también el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo fue uno de los actores que apoyaron la creación de coaliciones de empresarios por la educación en muchos países de la región y como decía Werner, ¿no? Bajo la etiqueta de estar apoyando la sociedad civil, o sea, haciendo como una comparación como si fuera lo mismo y a la vez promoviendo las reformas de los estados gerenciales, la descentralización de las políticas y de las políticas neoliberales. Entonces, yo creo que es importante entender más al detalle cómo y dónde se están dando estas alianzas entre estos actores, el sector, los estados, ¿no? Y cómo se están estableciendo estas relaciones orgánicas en la formación de las políticas educativas, porque se dan de manera opaca y compleja. Y en algunos espacios es interesante notar cómo individuos están ahí actuando particularmente, en otros son las organizaciones filantrópicas financiadas por estos individuos, en otros ellos actúan como redes, y eso les permite ganar una legitimidad simbólica. Creo que justamente en ese punto me parece que otro cambio importante en el contexto fue justamente que estos actores, ¿no? Las élites, el 1%, empezó a recibir una gran crítica en el inicio de los años 2010, con el movimiento Occupy Wall Street y otros movimientos, y que por eso empezaron a tener que influenciar las maneras de pensar y interpretar el mundo, y por eso empezaron también a entrar en el mundo de la educación, que era un espacio privilegiado para eso. Entonces, nada, creo que ante esa complejización del debate es fundamental pensar cómo dejar fluir nuestra imaginación política para construir nuevos modelos económicos y de interpretación del mundo, y especialmente modelos que sean capaces de dialogar con los deseos y expectativas de la ciudadanía y de adentrar las mentes y los corazones de las mayorías. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Thank you, Lara. It is indeed important to put into perspective the multi-stakeholderism trend within the framework of the development of capitalism and the growing political legitimization of corporations and big philanthropy. Your invitation to think alternatives, to let our political imagination flow, and the reasoning behind the surge of interest from capital in education is a great way to start off our Q&A. But before that, I would like to call now our last panelist, Gurumurthy Kasinathan. You haven't seen him in the original program, but we're very happy to have his contribution to this webinar. He's the director and one of the founders of IT for Change. Guru leads projects in the area of digital technologies in education. He also works in the areas of school leadership and free and open digital technologies. He has been a visiting faculty at TISS Deemed University for their master's program in education, where he has taught education leadership and management and ICT in education courses. Guru, thanks again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juliana. Happy to be here and wonderful to hear Madhuresh and the other two panelists who spoke before me. I'll focus my remarks specifically on the danger from big tech in this whole push for multi-stakeholder arrangements and governance. Over the last 20 years, IT for Change has seen that in various sectors, these big tech corporations have been able to use their economic power and also the large perception that is held in minds of people that technology has done good things for people. So they have this impression that, you know, Google is a company that ostensibly was set up with the motto of, you know, seeing no evil, doing no evil. That is how it was set up in the initial stages. So with the halo around them, they're able to more aggressively come into the governance spaces. And while in other sectors, we have had multilateral governance arrangements give way to multi-stakeholderism. In the tech space, we find that from the very beginning, multi-stakeholderism in governance has been touted as the way to govern. And that is simply because in other traditional areas, the governments have had a significant role as far as technology is concerned, it is these private sector companies, it is businesses that have been providing technology services to the world. And I'll quote a Republican senator who said several years back, he said there's something called the Google test. And he meant if Google can do it, Google should do it, and everybody else should stay clear of that. And of course, from his point of view, it also included governance of the technology spaces, the internet. So, as far as the internet governance or the technology governance arrangements have been concerned, from the very beginning, the business sector has very strongly pushed for multi-stakeholderism as a default method of governance, where the private sector has a very eminent role, the states also have, and as a consequence, as Madhuresh noted, civil society voices are always weaker. And what began as a very strong multi-stakeholderism push in the tech spaces have now started permeating into more traditional spaces of governance. Education has been amongst the last to be affected, as Madhuresh pointed out. And that is simply because education has not been the space where typically businesses have tried to make money across the world, because in the global north, public systems are still very dominant and strong. And in the global south, because of very huge underinvestment in education, typically there's no great market to speak of. There would be maybe a very small percentage of elite schools which might be able to afford technology, but the large school systems run by the governments have typically been too resource starved to be able to afford technology. And in a large country like, let's say, in India, technology has typically not been able to, it doesn't work. But now, one very important thing we need to keep in mind is COVID has completely changed the paradigm. During 2 years, India, for example, was one of the worst countries in terms of school closure. For almost the entire 2 year period, most provincial governments in India kept schools closed. And when schools were closed, obviously everybody felt that technology was the only way for teachers to connect to students, and online education became something of a mainstream idea. And over 2 years, attempts were made to make online education a kind of a norm. Thankfully, the pandemic effects have weakened a lot, and schools are, back in physical form. Nevertheless, the corporations are trying to suggest that the new normal of education is one where technology has a very important role to play. And if we see the tech space, every few years there is a new hype about technology. A new thing comes in. So some years back it was gamification of learning, and now the new kid on the block is personalized learning using artificial intelligence. And everybody, the businesses would like us to believe that artificial intelligence is going to sort of solve the problems in every sector. We've already seen that not only does it not solve problems in many cases, but it actually aggravates existing problems. And in some cases, it causes harm positively. And therefore, the role of AI has to be very, very carefully considered. In the case of education, AI will certainly have very serious challenges in terms of aggravating existing socio cultural economic inequities in the system, because by definition it functions by reproducing the past. And many countries, especially India, our education systems are heavily non are inequitable, and AI will further reinforce inequities. Unfortunately, in spite of the recognition that AI can be harmful, it is seen as an important way forward in education. The National Education Policy of India, for example, which was released a couple of years back, says that these technologies have to be really seen for their value in education. Recently, in Davos, in the World Economic Forum, a couple of provincial governments from India announced a tie-up with Byju's. Byju's is the uh, big tech as far as education is concerned. And I should have mentioned the word platform. So these new tech businesses are coming in the form of platforms, and we can see platforms in different areas of the economy: Google, Facebook, Amazon, uh, Uber. These are all platforms in different spaces of the economy and society. And Byju's wants to be a similar platform in the area of education. What a platform wants to become, a platform wants to become a monopoly or a oligopoly. And in education, we know that if we have a monopoly determining what education should be, the entire idea of education as a right, the entire idea of education as a process by which we can bring about equity and justice in society will completely go for a toss. The arrangements with Byju's have been announced, although there is no clue as to what will happen with the data that Byju's will harvest. We all know that artificial intelligence relies on data harvesting. And in the case of education, the important thing to consider is this data is going to belong to children, and children are going to be even more vulnerable to data harvesting, to surveillance capitalism than adults are. And this is a very, very big danger. So multi-stakeholderism has typically eroded issues of justice and equity in other spaces, but in the from the tech thing, the harm potential is even higher. So it's not only simply at a governance level, but at the individual safety and security level, tech is going to create problems by by its incursions into the education space. And of course, with privatization, we are going to see increasing stratification and inequity. That is on the economic side. On the pedagogic side, Madurai spoke repeatedly about how the whole idea of skilling has become important and how we are moving rapidly away from the ideas of holistic ideas of education. Education is really about creating a new society, about making democracy work. We are already seeing the ill effects of social media actually affecting democracy at large. And in fact, our education systems have to gear up to counter this whole issue of hate news, propaganda, fake news, which is WhatsApp universities, which is creating havoc in society. The school system and the college system have to actually counter that by bringing in ideas of equity, justice, and publicness into the system's principles. But the privatization through platforms like Byju's is taking us exactly in the opposite direction. Apart from data harvesting, which I mentioned, the whole idea of holistic education goes for a toss when we use artificial intelligence to sort of atomize learning into what is called as learnification. So this is a term that is used to suggest that instead of education, we now have learnification, where learners are put through more and more atomized experiences of learning, which don't help in conceptual understanding and which don't certainly give them an idea of holistic development and upbringing. Apart from the pedagogical problem of learnification, big tech has always promoted centralization, and centralization of education systems is something that is inimical to the ideas of good education. Now, there is one big problem here. Governments also love centralization because that gives them the illusion of being in control, illusion of being able to do things for the people. But we know that as far as governance is concerned, centralization is not a good approach because it puts power in the hands of few elite in society. And the idea of education as being something that can promote prosperity and benefit of all, welfare of all, is countered by the idea of using technology for further centralizing education systems and education processes. So assessments can get centralized, curriculum content gets centralized, and the control of the teacher goes down. So we are seeing gig workers in every sphere of the platform economy, and we know gig workers, they form what is called the precariat. They live in a very precarious condition. With Byju's, we can see more and more of this happening to teachers. Teachers are going to get, teaching is going to get de-skilled, and teachers are going to be the new precariat. Again, moving away from a secure permanent job as a professional to waiting for the call from Byju's to take a tuition class, pretty much like how Uber driver is waiting for the platform to allot him a job. And this aspect of centralization, this aspect of labor precariat is going to affect teachers at scale. And this is obviously going to have harmful effects on education. I'll just mention one point before I close. So to counter this, IT for Change has been part of setting up of what we call the National Coalition on the Education Emergency, which we set up in the year 2021, last year, more than a year back. And the National Coalition on the Education Emergency was formed to bring about greater awareness of the education emergency caused by COVID. And this pandemic caused school closure has created a hype about EdTech. So one of the priorities for the National Coalition on the Education Emergency is to suggest to governments that EdTech, the way they are imagining through an entity like Byju's or through personalized learning, is certainly not going to help children who are suffering from school closures. But there are alternate models where technology can be used for decentralized governance. And we have seen in so many examples across the world that technology actually can promote decentralized governance, technology can promote participatory governance, technology can promote greater power moving from the centralized to the peripheries. And that is something that can happen in education. There are excellent examples of that in India as well. So the provinces of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, for example, have been using technology in ways that support the public system, that support teachers and support teacher development. There are models that are already available. These models are relevant not only from India's point of view, but across the global context too, as Byju's and similar platforms threaten to go across the world to push their ideas of privatized governance of education, to push privatized curriculum, to push privatized models of pedagogy that disempower teachers. We need to counter them with public models which are already available, and which is something that the National Coalition on the Education Emergency has been promoting in India for a long time. One last thing I would like to say, in the platform space, an additional danger, which I think has not been covered so far, is the whole issue of venture capital. Now, traditional business, which is funded through traditional funding mechanisms, actually is less risk taking, whereas venture capital funded enterprises tend to adopt extremely what they call as innovative behavior, but these innovations can actually create huge threats for the economy and society. And we all are familiar with Mark Zuckerberg saying, move fast and break things. Of course, the things that will be broken are not those which belong to Facebook. They'll probably belong to vulnerable and marginalized sections in society. So the whole idea of venture capital funding has pushed these platform companies to take more and more risks to identify the innovations that will help them become monopolies, because the end game of venture capital funding is to create that monopoly or an oligopoly, and that is going to be a increasing danger to the idea of multilateral governance or public education as an idea. This is what I want to speak about in terms of the technology impact, the platform impact on multi-stakeholderism, and I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido. I would like now to open the floor for questions and comments. If you would like to speak, please raise your hands right now. I will, given the time constraints, we will ask you to be brief, no more than 2 minutes. Do we have any questions in the chat or in the audience? Anyone wants to speak? Well, while you think about it, I would like to just connect a question, well, that I had myself. Oh, is Vivek trying to speak?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear Vivek then.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So this is Vivek here. My question is to Gurumurthy, sir. There are so many non-profit organizations. There are examples, and I'm basically from Maharashtra. So I've seen some examples. They're distributing the subscription of Byju's free of cost for initial, let's say 4 years, 5 years to the community or their staff members as well. So as a IT for change, how do you look at it firstly? And secondly, do we have any, are we suggesting any alternative model, if not Byju or anything like that? So can you elaborate more on it? Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone? I will, you can raise your hand while I'm speaking, and it's connected to what Vivek asked. When Madharesh was presenting, he mentioned that now we have quite some money to bring technologies to schools everywhere, but we don't have any investments in buildings themselves. In our exchange, Guru, you mentioned the development of toolkits to enhance teachers' agency and public education system. Sorry, Janhali.
Yeah, I could hear you.
Okay, good. My question is how to, if this toolkits that you're talking about, an initiative that could be adapted globally and locally, as I mentioned, how to contrast that with regions where we don't have investments in education and infrastructure, basic infrastructure for schools.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so I'll quickly answer a couple of points. One is, I think Byju's is giving away its services free. It's exactly like Uber providing discounted rides in the beginning. So all platforms, or like Google provides gratis services, or Facebook services are gratis. Many services are provided free of cost by the platforms in the beginning. That is because they want to capture the market and they want to become a monopoly or a duopoly or oligopoly. But once they do become the default, like we know in India, for example, that Uber and Ola have achieved a kind of a duopoly in the entire market, and the traditional auto rickshaw or the taxi business has suffered a lot. So Uber and Ola have become the default. Now they are skimming the market and overcharging both the consumers and the drivers. So in the initial phases, they gave discounts to the customers and they give incentives to the drivers, and they capture the market. Once they do that, they will fleece, and that's the basic business model of platforms, where they want to price. Of course, in many cases, they won't even price the product because they get money out of selling the data. That's how, for example, Google and Facebook, which are the most profitable companies in the world, do not charge the people who use their products. So we don't pay anything for WhatsApp, we don't pay anything for Facebook, we don't pay anything for Google Maps. And that's because Google and Facebook are selling our data, harvesting our data for their economic benefits. That makes them one of the most profitable, amongst the most profitable companies in the world. There is an alternative to that, and I'll talk about education itself. And if you take the state of Kerala, I mentioned that we have IT for Change has, of course, initiated several models of using technology which do not de-skill teachers, but which make teachers or workers at the center of technology use. And by using teachers to build teachers skills in using technology for teaching, to enable teachers to create contextual content, which digital technologies can allow, we have alternative models and toolkits by which the system can become stronger and educational objectives can be achieved. So it's not simply teachers are doing better, but the entire system is doing better. It is not a coincidence that Kerala is the best state in India as far as education is concerned, far ahead of other states, and it practices these alternative models. Byju's went to Kerala government, and Kerala government said, we are not interested in you. We don't believe in your model. We believe in a tech model that actually promotes teachers' role and the professional development of teachers. And that's what our models we have learned from Kerala too. These models are already at work. The only problem is that while Byju's will advertise and sponsor the Indian cricket team and have a very high visibility in everybody's mind, the state government of Kerala will not do that, or the state government of Tamil Nadu will not do that. So the models that are progressive and workable are not, people are not aware of that. So that's one point. To quickly answer Juliana's question, actually the appropriate investment of scarce resources is a very, very important point. And it is very sad that you can have a computer in the building, but you don't have drinking water facility. And I think these decisions of very unfortunate investments without understanding priority are made because in many countries, including in India, these investment decisions are made at central levels. They're not made at the school level. If a school was given some money and told, you decide what you want to spend it on, they would probably spend on drinking water rather than have a computer. But somebody sitting at the capital decided that everybody should have computers. So in that sense, technology investments are often made without consideration of the real situation on the ground. And I want to point out here that the government of Andhra Pradesh, which is a state in India, has made a decision to spend 500 crore rupees, which is a huge amount of money, to buy tablets for the children, when in all likelihood they're actually closing schools because they cannot afford to run the number of schools that they have in the state. So that's a pathetic way of looking at investment in technology. But at the same time, we don't need to imagine that educational technology always means to have an expensive computer or internet out there. There are inexpensive contextual applications of technologies that can be done. For example, language learning can do with a lot of audio materials with digital technologies will support. I don't want to take too much time, so I don't want to have this also a wrong idea that digital technology is only expensive, and therefore unless you have everything else, you don't need to look at digital technology. That is not the case as well. We need to look at appropriate investments in digital technology which will help the school system without being extremely expensive. And those are possible in the models that, for example, Kerala and Tamil Nadu and the work of IT for Change has been focusing on.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to knowing more about them. We have time for one last question, maybe for our other panelists. Does anyone want to speak?
May I again?
Hi, Vivek.
Am I allowed to speak?
Yes, please,
Ask one more
Vivek.
question. Yeah.
Yes.
So my question is to Madhuresh. So Madhuresh sir, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Perfectly.
Yeah. So sir, whatever have been said by all three panelists. So can PPP model, with the help of PPP model, can we continue? Let's say there are so many examples we can see. We can visit so many examples, like in so many states or so many districts of Maharashtra or other states also. There are schools which are up to they're teaching to they're taking classes up to 7th standard in the English medium, let's say, and after that they're unable to continue with the classes. It's a public run school. So in such cases, can PPP model get succeeded with appropriate regulations? Like, how will you analyze, rather critically analyze it?
Well, but in the education sector, the PPP function, I think Werner and others can talk about it. But my understanding of the PPP model comes from the infrastructure project development, education being and health being one. But I think in the health sector, even in the road construction and several, even in the water sector. So some of the social sectors, I would say, and education comes under that. Some of the social sectors, our experience has been that the PPP model generally tends to be wherever there is profit for the private corporations, they come in. But if you look at the major chunk of money, is the money which is coming from the public resources. So it's not the public, the private partners are bringing resources. What they bring in is that they get access to the government resources. They get even they take loan from the public sector banks and others. But at the end of the day, the actual input. So if we think of the public-private partnership, then we really think that it's about equal participation of all of them. But somewhere it gets reduced to the idea that the public is the one who will front end a lot of the investments, monetary hard resources, and the actual benefits when it comes to that, it goes more for the private sector. And this has been seen across the board. And I would say that the highway, I think that in Maharashtra and where we are coming from in India, and I think this case is also true across the other countries as well, that highways gets created using the money and it's a lot of subsidies. Like, so say for land acquisition is done by the state, where a major chunk of money, same with the infrastructure, schools and everything are created by the state. And who pays the teacher's salaries. So if it's a permanent teacher, then the government will pay for that. And where is the private sector coming in? It is coming in only to say that, okay, we will do the course design for you. And same way they will say that, okay, we will do the road building for you. But then the road building, what it does is that it takes 30 years, 40 years, we are paying toll tax on the public. So I think the public ends up paying a lot more. And my experience is more on that side. So that's what I'm saying. But I think in the public sector, as in the education sector as well, this doesn't seem to have worked. Because I would leave it at that. That this doesn't seem to work. I would be more skeptical of saying that the PPP would work. And I think what we did see that when the IT companies, when they come in and say that they will provide the infrastructure for the IT infrastructure for ICT education in the education sector, but they are not giving so it's a PPP model. Most of it is PPP model, but their investment into the quote unquote key infrastructure or the fundamental infrastructure necessary for running a good school, they don't invest into that. A lot of that is still state owned, but the profit sharing is completely disproportionate to the investment they make. So I think the guiding motive is the profit, not the not the social concern.
I just
Thank
want to
you.
quickly add on the chat window, I have put a couple of links to articles. We did a study on PPPs in education in India and found out that, as Maduresh said, PPPs inherently are prone to failure because the motivation of the private player and the motivation of education are usually in conflict. I've given a couple of links in the chat. People can look at it.
Thank you, Guru Maduresh. Thank you. I'm now closing the floor as we don't have much more time, although I do have a few questions in my private chat. I would like to thank our panelists, our interpreters, and especially the Global Campaign for Education for making this happen. A big thanks also to Guru and to IT for Change for this last minute, but very insightful contribution, and to Maduresh for filling in so brilliantly. As mentioned in the opening of this webinar, this is a part of an effort to expose the risks and dangers of multi-stakeholderism. We have now looked deeper into the multi-stakeholderism whole of education, but as mentioned by Werner, this trend is expanding fast and in every sector of international governance. The Global Campaign for Education, IT for Change, and the Transnational Institute are here today as members of the People's Working Group on Multi-Stakeholderism, a coalition of networks, organizations, and social movements joining forces to stop the corporate capture of multilateral governance. If you're interested on the issue, we have also held a webinar launching this entire book, and another one on the chapter of health, held by People's Health Movement and D2H2. We also had a very recent webinar on the COVID crisis and multi-stakeholderism. So I invite you to look at it. I'll put the links in the chat in a moment. If you have any questions, or if your organization wants to join us in this struggle, please send us an email to pwgm@riseup.net. Let's finish up putting Laura's invitation to let our political imagination flow at the center of our activism. I hope you have enjoyed this session as much as I have, and thank you for being here, for sharing your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just let me also invite you to a new webinar happening on the 31st of August at 2 p.m. Johannesburg time on tax justice. We will be addressing the need to adequate financing for education and the relation with tax justice. So everybody's invited. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.